As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
That said, there has been very, very capable counterterrorism efforts in Indonesia, in the Philippines, and it continued also in Malaysia and Singapore that have kept those networks much more on the back foot. And in many ways, they are less capable now certainly than they once were. And I'll just say that this is, to some extent, I think, the repeat to a degree of a pattern that we've seen in the past, and that is where we see major conflicts heating up around the world, where there's a significant jihadist component to it, where groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS can gain a foothold, and especially where we see those flow of foreign terrorist fighters. Those are the lifeblood, if you like, of these global jihadist networks.
From the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii, welcome to another episode of the Security Nexus Webinar, where we explore the most pressing security challenges and geopolitical shifts shaping our world today. I'm your host, James Minnich, Colonel United States Army retired and professor here at DKI APCSS. It's a pleasure to have you with us for this insightful conversation in episode 22, Jihadist Terrorism in the Indo-Pacific, Resurgence and Resilience in the post-Caliphate era. Over the past decade, the global terrorism landscape has dramatically transformed, marked significantly by the rise and fall of ISIS. From 2014, ISIS's rapid ascent led to a surge in transnational terrorist activity, drawing tens of thousands of foreign fighters to its caliphate in Syria and Iraq. ISIS's sophisticated online propaganda portrayed the caliphate as a utopian Islamic state, attracting marginalized individuals worldwide, including from the Indo-Pacific. A steady stream of jihadists from South and Southeast Asia joined ISIS, bolstering its ranks and establishing transnational networks that facilitated resource, knowledge, and expertise transfers. These networks intensified terrorist activities in the Indo-Pacific, with groups like ISK carrying out numerous attacks in Afghanistan and beyond. Governments in the Indo-Pacific responded with increased surveillance, intelligence sharing, and military operations, achieving significant success, but underscoring the enduring terrorist threat. Despite ISIS's territorial defeat in 2019, jihadist groups have shown resilience, leveraging online platforms for radicalization and capitalizing on local grievances. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted counterterrorism efforts and shifted government priorities, while the rise of right-wing extremism added to the complex security landscape. The Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan in 2021 and the ongoing Israeli-Hamas conflict have further emboldened jihadist networks, creating fertile ground for extremist narratives and radicalization. Looking ahead, the Indo-Pacific faces a heightened threat landscape, necessitating a comprehensive approach that includes sustained pressure on terrorist networks, addressing root causes of radicalization, strengthening international cooperation, and enhancing information sharing. This multifaceted threat requires vigilance and adaptation to effectively counter the resurgence of jihadist terrorism. To delve deeper into these critical issues, it's my pleasure to welcome our esteemed guest, Dr. Sam Mullins, an expert in terrorism and a contributing author to the forthcoming book, The Indo-Pacific Mosaic, Comprehensive Security Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, which commemorates this center's 30th anniversary. I have the privilege of being the editor of this volume, and Dr. Mullins will be sharing insights from his chapter, Jihadist Terrorism in the Indo-Pacific, Resurgence and Resilience in the post-Caliphate era, providing us with a unique perspective on the evolving threat landscape. Sam, welcome back to the Security Nexus webinar.
James, thank you. Good to be back.
Yeah, many of our guests will remember that you were here on the 13th episode, during which we discussed competing in the gray zone.
Yes, exactly right. Yes. So hopefully looking forward to kind of delve into this particular aspect of it. It's part of the gray zone still, but a specific area of it. So again, looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, no, when we spoke last time, you specifically mentioned your expertise in terrorism, counterterrorism. And so I was eager to, I took that as an open door, was eager to have you back here, and so glad that you are here. Now, when we spoke last time,
Yep.
I did ask you to share with the audience a little bit about you and your expertise, and you did. You spoke about gray zone, but maybe today you'll speak about terrorism, counterterrorism.
Sure, yeah. So just to briefly recap, I had started off coming out of university. I was focusing on psychology, and then did a master's on investigative psychology, which is like a branch of forensic psychology. It looks at a combination of both what offenders are doing, including terrorist actors, and also looking at security services and military decision making and things of that nature as well. That was in 2005, and that was the year that we had the London bombings in the UK. By that time, of course, we had also, we'd had 9/11, we'd had a variety of other activities and major incidents that happened in Europe and elsewhere. That was when I had started focusing in terms of research and teaching on terrorism. I went on to do a PhD focused on terrorism, looking at a comparison of the US and UK in terms of their homegrown experiences with terrorism. And following that, as you know, I went on to work with at the Marshall Center based in Germany. And again, that was part of their counterterrorism program, which had been around for some time. So I've been doing this really, as I say, more or less full time since 2005. This is a great opportunity to talk a little bit about that. It's a landscape that's constantly evolving, new things unfolding all the time. And so again, happy to talk with you a little bit about what's happening today.
Oh, thank you for that. Let's go ahead and start talking about the post-Caliphate dispersal. So the territorial defeat in 2019 of ISIS's territory there in Iraq and in Syria. I mean, that led to the dispersion of its fighters and a shift in the strategy. So maybe here's the question. How has this impacted the nature and the tactics of jihadist groups here in the Indo-Pacific?
Yes.
So
it's worth, kind of briefly recapping. You touched on this in some of your opening remarks as well, and what you were just kind of describing. But it's hard to overstate just how significant I think that the rise of ISIS was. Going back from the beginnings of the conflict in 2011, the declaration of the so-called Caliphate in 2014, all the way through to the collapse of Baghouz in 2019. Tremendously influential impact on terrorist networks globally, and including in South and Southeast Asia, which are I think the key focal points in the Indo-Pacific region. So we saw, for instance, groups that were very quick to declare their allegiance at the time to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. ISIS Khorasan, ISK, of course, emerged in Afghanistan, very significant group there. We saw, for instance, Jamaat Ansar ad-Dawla, JAD, emerge as the preeminent terrorist organization within Indonesia, taking over the mantle from Jemaah Islamiyah. We saw a variety of groups in the Philippines also siding with ISIS. So Abu Sayyaf group, the different multiple kind of factions aligned with that, the Maute group, the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, and so on. And so we saw there was a period certainly of debate and disagreement, that sort of Al-Qaeda versus ISIS disagreement that persists to this day. But ISIS was enormously influential, and as associated with that, the flow of foreign terrorist fighters, the flow of fundraising in different directions, the spreading of expertise, the sort of logistical inputs for planning of attacks in Asia and so on, enormously influential. We also saw, of course, related to that, and talking about tactics and activities, renewed emphasis on taking and attempting to hold territory, both in Afghanistan and also in the Philippines with the siege of Marawi. We saw an increased emphasis on sectarian attacks, on suicide bombing, which even spread to the Philippines in 2019, which we had not previously seen before. I think most concerningly still, we saw increasing involvement in children, and also especially women in terrorism as well. Women haven't always played a key role in terrorist networks, but more significant still from that point onwards, in particular in terms of their role in actual attacks, right? And that has persisted in the post-Caliphate phase as well, I think enormously concerning. So, fast forward, okay, 2019 onwards, what did we see? Well, immediately after that, we saw the Easter Sunday bombings in Sri Lanka, of course, quite unexpected, I think. And that certainly would have been planned long before, I think, the collapse of the Caliphate itself, but nevertheless was indicative of that continued influence. And so what we did see, though, was, I think, an increasing emphasis on South Asia, especially by ISIS. ISK would already emerge as a key affiliate or province in their terminology. And I think a renewed emphasis on that. So in 2019, we saw a sort of attempt to reorganize some of ISK to focus on Pakistan and the rest of South Asia, in addition to Afghanistan. We saw an increase in South Asia-specific propaganda, including magazines like The Voice of Hind, trying to sort of up their recruitment and deepen their foothold in that part of the world. With some degree of success, if we look at, in particular, ISK's activities sort of during that period of time. So very, very influential, I think, in terms of South Asia. And of course, we see that is still a focal point, a key concern today, combined with some of the other elements that you talked about, the return of the Afghan Taliban to power and so on. A slightly different story for Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian militants have remained certainly steadfast in their commitment to ISIS as a brand, if you like, and they will continue to pledge allegiance to the latest leader of ISIS as each one is successfully killed and a new one emerges. And so that intent is absolutely still there. If we look at their online chatter, their propaganda and so on, again, still very, very active indeed. And there were still the remnants of those networks, which include, they were decimated by hundreds of arrests and captures and so on during that period. But there was still, the remnants of those networks are still there, both in and outside of prison. And so there was still the potential for some form of resurgence to occur. That said, there has been very, very capable counterterrorism efforts in Indonesia, in the Philippines, and continued also in Malaysia and Singapore that have kept those networks much more on the back foot. And in many ways, they are less capable now certainly than they once were. And I'll just say that this is, to some extent, I think, the repeat to a degree of a pattern that we've seen in the past, and that is where we see major conflicts heating up around the world, where there is a significant jihadist component to it, where groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS can gain a foothold, and especially where we see those flow of foreign terrorist fighters. Those are the lifeblood, if you like, of these global jihadist networks, incredibly inspirational, and along with it, all kinds of practical, tangible benefits for these groups as well. When those conflicts die down, as has been the case up until quite recently, these groups and networks, especially if they've been suffering from domestic counterterrorism and counterinsurgency efforts, tend to become a lot more inwardly focused, a lot more focused, frankly, on survival and on recuperation to the extent that they can do that. And along with that, what we tend to see is that they tend to focus their attacks much more domestically, more of, for example, not exclusively, but more so on domestic police, law enforcement, security services more than anything else. And so that is the phase that I think that we're in right now, especially pronounced in Southeast Asia, and a similar-ish sort of process going on in South Asia in the sense that, again, they're looking to essentially recuperate from the losses that they have suffered and regain some form of strength and capabilities.
I'm going to tell you, Sam, you have got some depth on this issue. I was taken back through some of your comments starting out in 2005, and when 9/11 happened, I'd already been in the Army 20 years. We had a hard time finding people who had much expertise in terrorism and what was going on. Clearly, you came in at a time we ramped up, and there was a lot of growth.
Sure.
Different era. I spent a bit of time in Afghanistan.
Yes.
It's dated now, but listening to you, reading your works on this, I want to take us a little bit and talk now maybe about Taliban and its resurgence. Resurged power, in 2021, it created a potential for jihadist groups and inspired extremism worldwide, one might argue. Let me ask you this question. What are the implications of this resurgence for the security landscape here in the Indo-Pacific?
Yes. So obviously the return to power in 2021 of the Afghan Taliban, I think, was enormously inspirational. For jihadist networks of different kinds, for different reasons, though. So obviously the Afghan Taliban is firmly in the pro-Al-Qaeda camp, and so for those groups and individuals who are on the Al-Qaeda side of the broader global networks, they see that obviously a tremendously positive thing that the Taliban regained power. And the message there essentially is strategic patience. It's keep at it, endure the losses, the suffering, and so on. Think about what we will eventually achieve, and hey, we can defeat a superpower, right? That's the message that they've received.
Yeah.
For ISIS, it's quite different in the sense that they are essentially and literally mortal enemies of the Afghan Taliban, and obviously resent that enormously. But at the same time, is still to some degree, I think, inspirational. If only because they now are extra motivated to try and undermine what the Taliban has done, right? And so for both sides, very much inspirational in that sense. There is concern, of course, about foreign terrorist fighter flows to Afghanistan, as we'd seen in the past. The security landscape is very different to what it once was. I can think of at least one case or two since the Taliban came back to power where somebody was arrested or prevented from that kind of travel. And so I think it's going to be a lot harder than what it used to be in the past. The bigger concern and the global concern, obviously, for the return to power of the Taliban is that Afghanistan will again reemerge as a launch pad for international terrorism, right? It is already certainly it never stopped being a safe haven for terrorist organizations. That continues to this day. The question is, how will that then be utilized by some of those groups? The Afghan Taliban, of course, had committed under the Doha Agreement to preventing its territory from being used for the purposes of terrorism, attacking other countries. The question is, to what extent are they sincere about that, and to what extent are they capable of doing that? And the answer is different for different groups again. So for ISK, they are sincere about that. That is in their own self-interest. That's their primary security challenge internally. And they have been conducting counterinsurgency, pretty brutal counterinsurgency campaigns against ISK to try and beat it down and reduce its operations. And they've had some success in that regard. Certainly during 2023, from that point onwards, we have seen a decline in ISK operations inside Afghanistan. There are some kind of knock-on effects to that, in terms of increased regional and extraterritorial operations that we're already starting to see, which speaks to the fact that they have limited capabilities, even with a group that they are sincere about. And then you take into account the other groups that they are actually allied with and have very close relationships with, most notably Tehrik-e-Taliban in Pakistan, or TTP, which is focused essentially on overthrowing the Pakistani government, or at the very least carving out its own significant chunk of territory in the northwest part of Pakistan there. And TTP has dramatically increased its operations ever since the Afghan Taliban came back to power. And that is now, of course, a major point of dispute between Pakistan and the Afghan Taliban. The Afghan Taliban has taken some steps, some measures to rein in part of what TTP is doing, some restrictions on members' movements and trying to move them away from border areas and things of that nature. But it is, by all accounts, insufficient and more of token sort of efforts than a true effort to really rein them in. And the only thing that we need to bear in mind here is that, look, we of course we want them to rein them in, and of course we want them to contain groups like Al-Qaeda and others as well. We also have to bear in mind there is a very difficult balancing act that the Taliban needs to play, and that is that if they are seen to be cracking down on some of those allied groups, or if they're seen to be, for instance, caving into Western demands too much, that will create all kinds of opportunities for ISK to exploit that, to further criticize the Taliban, and to draw in defectors to their side, which potentially leads to an increase in their capabilities as well. So it's a very difficult balancing act, but to sort of simplify things to some degree, sincere but lacking capability overall against ISK, and insincere overall but facing a difficult balancing act when it comes to some of those other groups. And those are the concerns going forward. Most immediately for the Indo-Pacific region, of course, it is Pakistan, first and foremost, that is affected. Brought beyond that is more of an inspirational sort of effect more than anything else.
So that's the Taliban.
Yes.
You've talked about ISK, the Islamic State Khorasan province. And so I want to pull further on this side. And maybe you can help us understand better about their capabilities, the group's goals, and then how can they be effectively countered?
Yes. So ISK, was formed in 2015, as we saw. They fairly rapidly had managed to gain control, or territorial control in Nangarhar and Kanal provinces in the northeast part of the country on the border with Pakistan. And they held that really, I think, through to late 2019, early 2020, as well as U.S. Troops were still in the country, and through a succession of U.S. aerial bombardments and somewhat actions by the Taliban, also in terms of ground activities, they lost that territory fairly quickly as well. As a result of that, they have become in many ways more pragmatic, I think, and focused first and foremost, again, on dispersing their fighters, not only throughout Afghanistan, but also regionally as well. So moving into Pakistan, moving into some other countries, neighboring Iran, for instance, as well. Seeking to persist, survive, seeking to undermine the Afghan Taliban whenever they possibly can, through a combination of sort of urban warfare, guerrilla warfare, hit and run style tactics, sometimes striking against high-profile Afghan Taliban targets in Kandahar and Kabul, places like that. But also across the border again in Pakistan, and in particular, and what we saw was an increase in their activities, their capabilities from about 2020 through 2022, which was right about the time, of course, that the Afghan Taliban had come back to power. In 2023, as a result, both of Afghan Taliban counterinsurgency efforts and international efforts as well, including, for instance, some counter-financing raids and arrests in Turkey, which had cut off some of their lines of funding coming back to Afghanistan. The tempo of operations decreased quite significantly during 2023. That will be the good news. The bad news is, if anything, it looks like they adopted a strategy then of quality over quantity, and so still able to conduct some very serious kind of terrorist attacks during that time frame. Already in 2022, we'd seen attacks on, for instance, the Pakistani and Russian embassies in Kandahar. We'd seen attacks on hotels hosting Chinese nationals and so on, looking to undermine those international relationships. We saw a continuation of high-profile attacks in 2023, just albeit more interspersed and intermittent. Most notably, what we've seen, of course, is an increase in their external operations activity as well. So we saw some very significant plots and then successful attacks inside Iran in particular as well. We saw a couple of, attempted cross-border attacks in some of the Central Asian nations, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. We've seen, of course, further afield, a string of most disruptive plots connected back to ISK in Western Europe. This year alone, in 2024, we saw major attack in Iran. We saw attack in a church in Istanbul with connections back to ISK. And of course, we saw the attacks in the Crocus concert hall just outside Moscow in Russia. More than 130 people killed in that operation. Now, it is worth bearing in mind that when we talk about these external operations, it is not just an ISK alone activity or effort. It's a good piece by Aaron Zelling and Warren Rocks that talks about this. It is much more likely to be a dispersed kind of ISIS global network approach to this. In particular, there's a kind of a office for the provinces worldwide that coordinates many of their activities. And that likely is playing a coordinating role as well internationally, along with supporting efforts from some of the supporting networks inside Turkey. So it's not just ISK by itself when it conducts these activities. It's drawing on a global network and global support from the rest of the organization to be able to do that. But nevertheless, it's demonstrating significant capabilities to conduct those kind of complex and often very risky operations. It's not quite the model that we saw in the past when people come to Afghanistan, get trained up, go back to conduct an attack. It's drawing more on that diaspora or diaspora populations that are out there already, some of whom already likely have experience from fighting in Syria and Iraq. And so much more of a kind of a virtually enabled approach to that, but nevertheless, as we've seen, with sometimes devastating effect. So they remain an extremely sort of potent threat.
Yeah, very insightful. I want to take the conversation a little bit to the Gaza war impact that's happening right now.
Yep.
In the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict, I mean, I think you could agree that it has inflamed some tensions and has sparked a surge in jihadist sentiment. And so let me ask you this question. How are jihadist groups in the Indo-Pacific exploiting this conflict in recruitment, propaganda, potential attacks, those types of things?
So it is a tremendous source of inspiration. You know, the director of the FBI has kind of gone on record saying, look, this is going to be the biggest source of inspiration since the Caliphate, right? There are some kind of very important practical differences between those two examples. There certainly is not the same opportunity, for instance, for foreign terrorist fighter flows to emerge. There just isn't that same ability to gain access to the conflict zone.
That's right.
And so in a practical sense, it's going to be quite different. But in terms of giving a sort of a motivational, inspirational boost to these groups and networks globally, absolutely, I think that is there. Again, we need to sort of distinguish between support to Hamas as an organization versus inspiration of the cause of the suffering of Palestinian people in particular. So for both Al-Qaeda and ISIS to different degrees, have both been strongly critical of Hamas. They see it as essentially a heretical organization for taking part in democratic political process, also for its ties with Iran and Hezbollah, Shia, and therefore, for them, the mortal enemy. But nevertheless, that doesn't stop them being heavily motivated by the suffering that they see and by the overall inspirational caused by, the cause itself. And so we've seen both Al-Qaeda and ISIS, again, the different factions coming out and making public propaganda statements, calling for their followers to conduct attacks all over the world, wherever they can, particularly against Israeli and Jewish targets, also Americans and Western targets in general. So it's a pretty broad target set that they're advocating. If we look, at groups within the Indo-Pacific specifically, we see a great deal of discussion of what is going on. It's something they're discussing all the time. They're translating propaganda that's being produced in the Middle East and so on back into local languages for their audiences back home. They are seeking to capitalize on that again, to motivate and to inspire their networks. They are calling sometimes for travel to the conflict zone. We've seen, again, at least one example. A teacher from Singapore who'd been arrested, prevented from making that journey. Again, unlikely, I think, that they would be successful anyway, unless that conflict broadens significantly. But at least it's part of what they're thinking about and talking about and attempting to do sometimes. There certainly, if I step outside of our region a little bit, certainly in Central Asia, I know that there has been fundraising efforts surrounding that what's happening in the Middle East. I would be very surprised if we weren't seeing the same sort of things taking place across Asia as well. But first and foremost, again, it's propaganda, it's recruitment, and it's kind of inspiration more than anything else. And if we look at it in practical terms, if you compare, for instance, South Asia, specifically where we know there's a connection to the war between Israel and Hamas, there's very, very little to talk of. When you compare that to Europe, for instance, we've a string of mostly low level, but certainly some successful attacks and plots and so on related to it. And it kind of pales into comparison. And again, I think comes back to, I think the groups in South Asia have, if you like, more pressing priorities and agendas. The groups in Southeast Asia, I think, again, are just really lacking in their own capabilities right now, looking just to survive, first and foremost, more than anything else. And again, being more inwardly focused at present. And the only caveat I will say, James, right now is that it's still early days.
Yeah.
And so sometimes we're less than a year into this conflict. these things can take a long time to unfold. And so that's potentially something that we can still see in the months and years ahead.
No, thank you for sharing that those thoughts on that. Let's talk about pull a little bit on you were speaking about propaganda and recruiting and these things. And so online radicalization. I think jihadist groups increasingly rely on those platforms, certainly much more so than, earlier when you were beginning the studies. Just technology has taken us there. So let me ask you this question. What strategies could effectively counter online radicalization and disrupt these networks?
Yeah. So it's funny you mentioned when we were first getting into this, and I think, we had all these, a lot of research and a lot of debates and so on around, what is the role of the internet in radicalization and recruitment, right? And I think that traditionally we kind of looked at online and offline as two separate spaces. And certainly myself, I always looked at, offline in-person interaction being in many ways more influential, more kind of more important than things that people were doing online. Increasingly, I think that we've come to understand that it's the two are kind of really just so closely intertwined that it's almost an artificial distinction, especially in the lives of people growing up today, right? It's just an integral part of everything that people do, and it's the same in this space as well. So it's important for radicalization, spreading of propaganda, important as a mechanism of vehicle for recruitment, also for all the other activities that there are, fundraising and planning, conducting attacks, and all these other kinds of things. So extremely important, and especially I would say, in some of the countries like, say, Singapore or Malaysia, for instance, that have a very tight grip on security overall, very successful, online self-radicalization is probably their primary concern when it comes to terrorism. Whereas in countries where there's a little bit more space for groups to operate and to actually get together and organize, there are more permissive physical environments. It still plays a role, but not quite as paramount, right? All of that said, so what can you do about it? We have seen, there's at least two major sorts of lines of effort, I would say. One is, content moderation and censorship. And we have seen that can play, I think, an important role for reducing the online space that these groups have. You look at the heyday of ISIS going back, 2014, 2016 kind of period. They were all over mainstream forums like Twitter and, Facebook and all these other things. And it was tremendously valuable for them. They were able to reach a much broader audience than had they not had those tools available to them. After there was a pretty major sort of concerted effort by tech companies with the pressure coming from governments to remove those accounts, their online space shrunk dramatically, right? All that to say that today they are still on Facebook, they are still on YouTube and TikTok and all these other things, and so even those mainstream platforms are still an important part of terrorist recruitment and networking and so on today. And of course, again, it's a bit of a cat and mouse game too, in the sense that if you take them effectively off a major platform or major platforms, they're going to migrate to smaller platforms, more obscure, where content moderation is less of a concern or is there is less ability to do that. So that is another dynamic. That's also a positive thing, in my opinion. I think that the more that we push them into far corners of the online space, the better. But it is a dynamic that we have to be aware of. So content moderation and censorship, it's important. It has a real role to play. It's not a panacea. That's the only thing, right? Your other side of it then is really looking, I think, at counter narratives, whether that is looking to discredit terrorists and their activities and things that they do, and or promote sort of positive alternative narratives, which frankly I've seen less of. That's an important line of effort or lines of effort there as well that governments can support. They're probably not best to play the lead role in that space. It's better to come from sort of grassroots, civil society organizations and so on when we're talking about those lines of effort. And I think that they're important. I think that they need to continue. But we have to recognize also that it's much, much harder to demonstrate when these are being effective. Whatever metrics we can, demonstrate, when that's truly having an effect, very, very, very challenging and difficult to do. but it's nevertheless part of the long term, whole society approach to all of this. The third kind of piece to this that I think that we increasingly there was more effort to get at is working with tech companies on, frankly, the algorithms which drive the delivery of content to online users. And so we've seen research that has demonstrated, with terrorist and violent extremist materials that, hey, if you start looking at that, you start interacting with those individuals, guess what? You're going to get sent more of that stuff as a result of these algorithms. And that potentially can drive people further down that sort of rabbit hole of extremism. And so that remains an unresolved sort of challenge right now. There are important efforts. The Christchurch call is one of those, and there's things like Tech Against Terrorism and so on. There's increasing dialogue more and more these days between governments, private sector, civil society, academia, to really get at these issues, to research it, and to try and find solutions to it. Part of it, again, requires that we need to be able to look under the hood of how these platforms actually operate and deliver content, and that will help, I think, to inform some of the potential solutions to this. And there's a lot of talk about things like AI and so on as being a driver of potential solutions for this too. And I'm sure that will be part of the equation going forward. From a government perspective, we need to be doing all of these things. And we also, quite frankly, we need to collaborate with these different with these different stakeholders. Sometimes there's got to be pressure. There's got to be a little bit of coercion there too. And so you have to have in place appropriate legislation, for instance, to force tech companies to be a little bit more transparent, or to force them to take down content in a reasonable space of time. And that is sometimes the push that they need to play a more proactive role.
That's actually fairly extensive. So I hope that some of those listening may be able to pull some of those thoughts you gave. I thought those multifaceted in this way that to get after this. Let's talk a little bit more though about the challenges in counterterrorism. And so the complex and evolving nature of jihadist threat, I mean, it demands, this multifaceted approach. So here's the question then. What are the pressing challenges and opportunities for developing effective counterterrorism strategies here in our region?
Yeah. So let me start off on a kind of a positive note then, and just say that, especially if we look back at the progress that's been made over the last 20 years, for the Indo-Pacific, globally as well, we've seen an enormous amount of progress being made. And countries across our region are more and more effective in terms of their counterterrorism, counterinsurgency capabilities, far more certainly than they were, in the past, as we talked about. Southeast Asia, there tremendous amount of progress that's been made there. Very, very impressive, very effective. South Asia too, with facing significant challenges right now still, but there's been some really impressive kind of progress that's been made against these groups as well at times. And on top of that, it's not just the tactical operational sort of stuff. We're seeing innovative, a comprehensive sorts of efforts. We're seeing a variety of different, preventing and countering violent extremism sorts of programs, de-radicalization, reintegration of foreign fighters, all those kinds of things. So there's an awful lot that's been done, a lot of progress that's been made. Now, in terms of ongoing challenges, there are many of those as well, right? If I think about the Indo-Pacific, I think, there's a number of interconnected challenges that we can highlight. So one of those really just comes down to geography. We're talking about some difficult terrain and porous borders, which terrorists are able to exploit to their advantage. You squeeze the balloon on one side, they move to the other, that sort of dynamic. And that's incredibly challenging to get after when we think about the scale of the places that we're talking about, right? There are some examples, I think, where states are getting after that pretty well. You think about the trilateral cooperation agreement between Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, right? And the Sulu and Celebes Sea. And that's a really good example of three countries coming together and doing a really good job of containing a threat, right? Can you replicate that, for instance, or something like a land-based version of that, maybe, in Afghanistan, Pakistan? which is where a key part of all of this is happening right now.
Mm.
I think realistically, the answer is no. And this comes to the second challenge, which I think, frankly, is just the deep-seated sort of geopolitical rivalries and challenges that we have between states, especially in South Asia versus Southeast. And that ultimately is just such an important and difficult barrier to overcome in terms of how we get after some of those threats, right? Um, a sort of a interconnected a third kind of challenge here, and it's paradoxical in a way, right? So we have the success of tactical operational approaches, police, military, intelligence, and so on, and those have been very effective at dismantling networks. And really, and sometimes they just push them across the borders, as we talked about, but to a large extent, really kind of debilitating these groups for periods of time. The downside, of course, to that is there are still heavy-handed tactics. There are still, cases where we are feeding the grievances of local populations, and that is sustaining these groups at the same time as we're beating them down. And that's a common dynamic in counterterrorism, right? Is how do we avoid those sort of excessive use of force and so on, and avoid making the problem worse in the process. At the same time, of course, if we rely too heavily on a tactical operational approach, maybe we don't put enough resources and investment in some of these other things that we know are important, like going after the underlying grievances, the political conditions that can allow some of these groups to thrive. And so those are some of the dynamics that I think that we see in the region, and again that we need to try and focus more on, more attention, more effort and more focus on how do we kind of overcome and move beyond that sort of kind of mowing the grass approach where you're just periodically kind of beating them down.
I'm going to pull on your talk about grievances and root causes of extremism. Grievances are among those. There may be others, but the question is then, how can governments and civil society organizations work together to address these underlying factors and promote this regional peace and stability we want?
Yeah. And again, easier said than done, right? Easy to point out what the problem is, so much harder to really say what is the sort of solution to that. When we talk about root causes, obviously we do have to recognize that, when we're talking about whether it's poverty or unemployment or, poor education or political marginalization and so on, none of those things are necessary for terrorism to occur, and nor are they sufficient, right? And that doesn't mean that they aren't important. I think they have an incredibly important role to play in many different contexts where we do see terrorism. They're exploited routinely by terrorists in terms of propaganda, recruitment. They understand those local grievances and exploit them to their advantage. And we just have to recognize that it's no panacea, it's no magic bullet. We're not going to be able to, if we give everybody a job, is that going to make terrorism go away? It's not, obviously not that simple either, right? Nevertheless, we got to find a way. How do we get after those underlying conditions? And again, we've got to recognize it's a long term. It's basically a never-ending effort. There's no sort of end goal, frankly, for it to say when we fixed this particular so-called root cause and things will be okay. So how can we go after it? In a practical sense, I think it is worth highlighting there are a number of sort of resources out there that governments or local governments or communities can look to for support, and if they're looking at how do we fix some of these issues. You can look to, there's the HEDIAR Center of Excellence for Preventing Countering Violent Extremism in the Middle East. There's the Global Community and Engagement Fund can fund some of these kinds of local level projects. USAID provides some funding. I know Australia and other countries have kind of various pots of money and so on available, and resources and expertise to support these lines of effort. How you actually go about doing that, there's obviously no kind of fixed template for that. Everywhere is going to be context unique. What I would just say this, James, and maybe this will relate to some of your experience in Afghanistan too. Sometimes we can think, oh, we have a set of problems, we know what the grievances are, we're going to go in there and fix it. Sometimes that is not really the problem. And until you've really spent the time to go into local communities and have some, sit down and really talk and have some difficult conversations and find out and listen, frankly, and find out what are the grievances and the issues that need to be solved, then you can be spinning your wheels, right, and not necessarily moving things forward. So as a basic principle, I would just say start with engagement and listening, figuring out exactly what the key grievances are. From there, you can come up with plans and strategies for how to go about fixing them, and then you can look for various resources to support all of that. Last thought on it, James, was this, is, when we do, whether it's aid and development or, those types of activities, don't do it under the heading of CT.
Yeah.
Because, you're stigmatizing people and communities and so on in the process. And frankly, it's a much greater good and a broader focus than just that.
Yeah, no, well said, well said. In the interest of time, let's go ahead and transition to some audience questions. We have quite a few.
Okay.
I think I'll pull off of your last comments about different responses from external actors. In this case, I want to pull on the U.S.'s role in global counterterrorism. So following the territorial defeat of ISIS, how has the U.S. response to global terrorism evolved? And what does that role look like today here in the Indo-Pacific?
So it is now, I would say, less military centric and less US led. Greater emphasis on some of the non-military aspects of counterterrorism, and we're in a role where the US is more of an enabler and a supporter, with partners, international partners and allies playing lead roles. That really, I think, summarizes how it has moved forward. We, of course, have seen a reduction in some of the resources that are available for counterterrorism, going back to the National Defense Strategy of 2018, since then onwards. But there is still, again, an enormous amount that is still being done in this space. So you have the State Department's Bureau of Counterterrorism as a focal point for some of these activities. We mentioned USAID that has funding and so on available for PCVE. Also for various development projects related to this. You have FBI offering investigative support. You have Department of Homeland Security Investigations Branch. You have the U.S. Treasury. The list goes on. There are all these different agencies, departments that are still providing support in terms of, training and expertise, in terms of capacity building, in terms of, equipment, investigative support, and so on and so on. At the same time, the U.S. also, of course, supports multilateral efforts through the UN and Interpol and the Global Counterterrorism Forum, and so on and so on. So there is still an awful lot there being done to support and enable and boost the capabilities of international partners. It just isn't as much in the lead, and it isn't as military centric as it once was. The big gap, of course, is really, what do we do with Afghanistan? And that's really the biggest question, frankly, not just for the Indo-Pacific anyway, but really because of the global implications of that. And that's probably the biggest. So I would say the U.S. approach, by and large, right now has evolved into more efficient, but also very appropriate approach to all of this. And with that one gap being that's an area where we're relying on so-called over-the-horizon capabilities, which are probably insufficient for the nature of the threat that we're facing there today.
Yeah, well said. But this next question is asking us about emerging threats and regional cooperation, and it's asking about, beyond the traditional jihadist terrorism, what are the most significant emerging threats here in the region? And then the question, how can regional cooperation be strengthened to address these diverse challenges?
Okay. So on the emerge, so let me say, we've obviously been talking about ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and related networks. That's certainly not re-emerging, right? But enduring more than anything else. We touched on transnational right-wing terrorism networks. Certainly also, I would say, enduring, not necessarily emerging. That tends to be, of course, dominated by lone actors, like we saw in Christchurch and elsewhere. But they're part of a transnational online community that contributes to that. And again, online radicalization being a key part of that. We also, of course, have enduring challenges within our region in terms of ethno-nationalist separatists and left-wing extremist groups also. So all of those things are still churning away in the background, and I think will largely persist in similar form to what we're seeing right now for the foreseeable future. In terms of truly emerging sorts of things, I go back maybe to the Israel-Hamas conflict and maybe some of the fallout from that down the line that could evolve in perhaps unpredictable ways. If we're looking ahead, if we're really sort of trying to, let's say, what direction, what things could come out, in future. One thing, one area that I've been looking a lot at is connections between climate change, and insecurity and conflict. One of the things that we're seeing today is increased environmental activism. And for the most part, that is a good thing and pressures governments to do the right things and so on. Environmental activists are also frequently the victims of frankly, government and other oppression, more so than they are anything else. But also true that they contribute sometimes to civil disorder and unrest and sometimes acts of violence. We think ahead to 2040, 2050, at least that kind of time frame, where we're expecting to see much more intensified impacts of climate change, where the potential for frustration and anger is much greater. We're also then, I think, looking at increased risks associated with some of that side of things. We've seen environmentally motivated terrorism in the past. Not unreasonable to expect that we might see a reemergence of that in future, and especially if we see harsh government crackdowns, because oftentimes it's that government use of force that acts as the spark to escalate things further. So that's maybe just one aspect that we need to think about. And very briefly, how do we improve cooperation? Keep working at it. It's never, again, there's no end state to that. Yeah. We saw all kinds of advancements during, it was one of the silver linings to ISIS, all that progress that was made. And we see continuing efforts. Singapore stood up, a new counterterrorism information facility in 2021, I think it was, focused on sharing information between law enforcement and military. That's a great example of yet another post-ISIS or post-Caliphate, at least, initiative. We've just got to keep working at that and refining the processes and mechanisms that we already have.
This next question makes me think about what you were just speaking about, and that is where we can put our focus, because frankly, governments can only do so much at one time. And so this one's asking about major powers and counterterrorism. And so the question really is, how does major power rivalry, great power competition, stated differently, between the U.S. and China affect our counterterrorism efforts in the Indo-Pacific? And then the follow-on to this is, and what actions are major powers, China, Russia, India, U.S., those taking to assist countries in the region in their counterterrorism? I think asked differently, there's great power competition overshadowing our counterterrorism efforts. But you go ahead.
So, we talked a bit about what the U.S. is doing in terms of CT. China, Russia certainly are active through, for instance, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the CT exercise, that kind of thing. China has always sort of taken again, I think a backseat in terms of, for instance, you take their relationship with Pakistan. China has never decided to go in there militarily itself to go after terrorists. They prefer to enable partners like Pakistan to go after terrorists themselves as the country in question. There is probably technical support and export of technologies and that type of thing that's related to CT efforts there as well. India, I know, has provided, finance and support to Sri Lanka after the Easter Sunday bombings. Those kinds of efforts are there, and certainly cooperates with countries on its borders, where again we've seen that cross-border dynamic, militants exploiting those areas. So all of them are doing bits and pieces, right, to support the counterterrorism effort. Getting back to the central point of the question, though, to what extent does great power competition influence that? The historical record, frankly, I don't think is good. We certainly thought that CT could be something that we could all focus on, right? That we could put some of those issues aside and we could cooperate on this shared issue. And unfortunately, that has not truly worked out. We do see, of course, continued information sharing. Most recently, the U.S. shared intelligence with Russia and has shared intelligence with Iran prior to some of the attacks that have taken place. Vice versa, going back to the Boston Marathon bombings, sometime prior to that, Russia had flagged one of the individuals associated with that, right? The issue, and I think that the limiting factor when it comes to CT cooperation in this context, is that there is always a lack of trust between those different partners and what to make of some of the information that they may be sharing, perceptions of and suspicion about agendas and so on. more importantly, what it comes back to is probably the fundamental thing in all of terrorism, and that is how do you find and understand the problem? And so certainly China, and I think Russia also, they take a very expansive view of how you define terrorism, extremism, and so on. And then that acts as a foundation for a very broad and indiscriminate approach to counterterrorism, which runs up against, human rights and civil liberties and so on. And so far from being just an academic debate, that how we perceive and define it is going to absolutely limit the extent to which we can cooperate. Because if you're saying to me, well, we have this extremist, this terrorist that we want you to go after, and I'm looking at this person and saying, well, this person really is just a non-violent activist and they're just, peacefully advocating for change, then that's where you're going to run into some of those difficulties. And being a little bit pessimistic here, James, I don't see that we will advance counterterrorism, certainly not in the current state, much further than where we've gotten to already.
Let's take one last question, and I'm going to ask you about this nexus between freedom of speech and security, and that kind of gets after what you were just alluding to at the end of your last comment. And so, how do we thread this needle?
Yeah, all the easy questions.
All easy.
So again, each country is going to have its own set of values or its own threshold for exactly where that balance is found, even among allies and partners, right? If you take the US versus Europe, for instance, the US has we both, of course, both sides of that equation adhere to human rights and to freedom of speech, right? But we have very different sort of legal approaches as to how and to what extent we can enforce that. And so, as a consequence, in Europe, there's a whole range of offenses that are frequently relied upon, things like incitement of hatred, incitement of terrorism, apology for terrorism, and so on, which are successful grounds of prosecutions for individuals because mostly what they've said as opposed to anything else. And you could not prosecute for those things in the United States. So there were some key, differences even there.
That is true.
So how do you get after that? How do you try and get towards an acceptable level for your particular country? I think that it has to be a process of consultation in terms of finding that correct balance. And so, for instance, when we see countries that are being, I think, responsible about this, when they roll out new counterterrorism legislation and there are those kinds of provisions in it, there is often a sort of a public consultation process where civil society and academia and journalists and so on are part of the conversation and can raise concerns. And then there can be, a process of revision to that. So consultation important. Another piece to it, I think, is accountability. So whatever, provisions are in place, you want to make sure it's not being abused and it's not being used to go after journalists or academics or just, the political opposition, right?
Right.
And that there is a process for to be able to appeal against those sorts of abuses of power and so on. And then related to that, it's good to have, and this is a model that the UK and I know that Australia has as well, is an independent reviewer of terrorism legislation or of national security legislation. And this is somebody who is security cleared from an appropriate legal background, is able to review that legislation, not just in a box, but goes out and also has consults with all the different stakeholders and is able to make recommendations about how that sort of legislation should be adapted going forward. And I think if you put in place those things, you have accountability, you have consultation, you have independent reviews of those sorts of powers, then you can try and you have a better chance of successfully managing that sort of those pitfalls.
Sam, we're going to leave it there. That has been tremendously insightful. In the last 30 seconds or so, I don't want to let you leave without leaving a book recommendation for the audience. So
sure, I'll be quick. One that I'm reading right now is on this topic is The Islamic State in Khorasan, and that is by Antonio Giustozzi. Great methodology, very interesting, lots of first-hand information coming out of ISIS in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Sam, again, thank you so much for this time together. As we conclude, it's clear that the threat of jihadist terrorism in the Indo-Pacific demands a multifaceted approach that addresses immediate security concerns and the underlying drivers of radicalization. By understanding the complex dynamics of this threat and working collaboratively to develop and implement comprehensive solutions, we can build a more secure and resilient future for the region. Now, I encourage you to join us on August 5th for our next Security Nexus webinar, China's Strategic Culture, Confucianism or Realpolitik, featuring Dr. Lucas Filler. In that session, we'll unravel the intricate tapestry of how the ancient wisdom of Confucianism continues to weave its thread into China's contemporary geopolitical strategies. From all of us at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii, thank you for being a part of this important conversation. I'm James Minnich, and until we meet again, aloha away. As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.